The night they buried her dignity in front of 500 witnesses, Duchess Evelina Ashbourne did not cry. She stood at the far end of the Winter Sovereign Ball's grand hall, dressed in deep midnight blue with silver thread along the collar, her dark hair pinned back with small clips the color of old pewter. Her posture was straight, her chin level, her expression carved from something colder than grief. She watched. She counted the smiles. Lady Hawick leaned toward Lady Cressida Morn behind a painted fan, whispering something that ended with laughter. Lord Fenwick did not bother to lower his voice at all. He stood with 3 other lords near the fireplace, swirling his glass, and said clearly enough for a row of people to hear, 32 and still alone. The Ashbourne line dies with her. No one corrected him. Not one person in that gleaming hall, draped in candlelight and perfume and silk, said a single word in her defense. The Queen Mother, seated on her elevated chair like a monument to cruelty wrapped in pearls, let her eyes travel slowly across the room until they landed on Evelina. Then she smiled, not warmly, the way someone smiles at a problem they have decided to stop tolerating. Evelina turned and walked out, not fast, not with tears streaming and hands trembling. She walked out the way a woman walks when she has already decided something, and the decisions has settled so completely inside her bones that there is nothing left to feel except the weight of what comes next. She descended 17 stone steps from the ballroom level. She passed the kitchens. She passed the servants' corridor. She passed the locked iron door that every member of her household believed led only to a flooded cellar. She used her own key. The candles below lit themselves before she reached the bottom of the stairs. Not with flame, with a sound like screaming that faded the moment it began. And deep in that hidden chamber, on a long stable carved with symbols older than the kingdom above her, lay something that was not yet finished. Not dead, not alive. Waiting, Evelina walked to the edge of the table and looked at it for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, into the dark, "They want me married. Then I will give them a husband." She pulled on her working gloves, and she began. Before we go further into what happened in that underground chamber, you need to understand the world that drove Duchess Evelina Ashbourne to stand there in the first place. Valedorn was a kingdom built on appearances, not on strength, not on wisdom, on the careful, suffocating performance of what was expected. The nobility did not simply live their lives, they displayed them. Every banquet was a stage, every gown was a statement, every marriage was a contract signed with a reputation as ink. And in this world, a woman without a husband was not simply unmarried, she was unfinished. That was the word they used, unfinished, as though a woman were a piece of furniture awaiting its final coat of paint, useless, and somehow embarrassing to look at until someone claimed her. Evelina had been born into one of the oldest noble families in Valedorn. The Ashbournes had held their estate and title for 6 generations. She had more land, more ancient blood, more quiet influence than half the people who mocked her. She spoke 4 languages. She managed her estate accounts personally. She had kept Ashbourne Manor running through a drought and a trade embargo that had crippled lesser houses. None of that mattered, because she had no husband. 10 years earlier, she had nearly corrected that fact. Lord Cedric Valmond had courted her for 2 seasons, and she had let herself believe it. She had allowed herself to feel something real, quiet, Careful, private love, the kind she kept close to herself like a flame she was afraid to let the wind reach. She had been 22. He was charming, and when his family's political position became stronger by aligning with the Dermont line instead, he had not simply left. He had dismantled her on his way out. Stories circulated through the noble circles within weeks that Evelina was cold, unstable, that physicians had privately confirmed she could not carry an heir. None of it was true. All of it stuck. She never confronted him. She withdrew instead into Ashbourne Manor, into her books, into the hidden knowledge she had discovered in the oldest section of her family's sealed truths. Library. Book sealed with wax the color of dried blood. Journals written in a hand so small and compressed the words seemed to be hiding from themselves. Forbidden alchemy. Her family, she learned, had not always been simply nobles. Generations before the church rose to its current power, the Ashbournes had been something else, entirely practitioners of the old sciences, the ones the church had burned libraries to erase. They had hidden their knowledge inside the manor's foundations, beneath the stone, beneath silence. Evelina had found it when she was 24. She had spent 8 years learning it alone. She told no one. And then came the winter sovereign ball, and Lord Fenwick's voice carrying across a room full of people, and the Queen Mother's satisfied smile, and the realization that the world would never stop until she gave it what it demanded. So she decided to give it something it had never imagined. The room beneath Ashbourne Manor was not what you would expect a forbidden alchemist's laboratory to look like. There were no cobwebs, no crumbling walls, no scattered bones. It was clean, ordered, maintained with the same precise attention Evelina gave to everything she touched. The stone floor had been scrubbed until it was nearly pale. The shelves along the walls held jars of dark liquid, bundles of dried matter, sealed containers of powdered mineral, and stacks of handwritten notes organized by date. Brass instruments of measurement sat on a long work table beside a set of scales, so fine they could measure a single drop. And in the center of the room, on the stone table, was the shape of a man. He had been months in the making. Evelina had worked from the old journals, from the instructions her ancestors had written in their compressed, careful script. She had sourced materials she could not name to anyone without risking her life. She had learned, through failure and painstaking repetition, that the body alone was the easy part. The body was crafted. What came after was something else. She stood at the table now and looked at what she had built. He was tall, and she had planned it that way. Sharp lines at the jaw, dark hair pressed flat against his head, as though it were waiting for wind to disturb it. His hands were folded at his sides. His face was still in a way that went beyond sleep. It was the stillness of something that had not yet decided to exist. She had a name ready. Lucien. She had chosen it from the old language, where it meant light. She had not told herself why. She preferred not to examine it. She opened the oldest journal, the one whose pages had gone the color of autumn leaves, and found the final sequence. She had memorized it months ago, but she read it again tonight, because this was not the sort of work you did from memory alone. This was the sort of work you did with every conscious layer of yourself present and paying attention. She lit the circle of prepared salt. She pressed her palm to the first carved rune on the table's edge. She spoke the words. The chamber did not shake. There was no crack of thunder, no burst of visible light. What happened was quieter than that and more disturbing. The air changed. The temperature dropped so sharply that her breath became visible. The candles around the room pulled their flames low, almost to nothing, and then held there, trembling. The jars on the shelves vibrated slightly against their shelves. The scales tipped without any weight upon them, and then the shape on the table drew a breath. Not a gasp, not a dramatic, heaving return from death, just a slow, steady pull of air into lungs that had not been used before, and the quiet release of it. His chest rose and fell, his hands loosened slightly at his sides, and then his eyes opened, silver, not pale gray or light blue, silver the color of something that had never seen sunlight, that had been formed in the deep places where light had not yet reached. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then his gaze moved slowly and without panic to Evelina. She had prepared herself for this. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would establish control immediately, how she would be clinical and composed. She said nothing for a full 30 seconds, because his eyes, silver as they were, held something she had not expected. Not blankness, not the empty obedience of a created thing. Confusion. And behind the confusion, something quieter, something that looked unsettlingly like sorrow. She recovered herself. "Can you understand me?" she asked. His mouth moved. The sound that came out was imperfect consonants struggling, vowels stretched wrong, but the word was recognizable. "Yes. Do you know what you are?" A pause. His brow shifted slightly, the first real expression on his face. "No, you are Lucien," she said. "And you belong to me." She said it without cruelty. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather or the hour of the day. Matter of fact. Settled. His silver eyes stayed on her face. "Lucien," he repeated, testing the word the way someone tests ice before they step onto it. Then, after a moment, "And you?" "I am the Duchess Evelina Ashbourne," she said. "You are my husband." He was quiet for a very long time after that. Not the silence of a thing that does not understand. The silence of a mind sorting something too complex to sort quickly. She used the time to begin the next phase of the work. The binding sequence, the words that would tie his continued existence to the manor, to her, to the agreements she had carved into the stone beneath him. She worked precisely, her voice steady, her hands sure. He watched her throughout, and when she finished, and the silver in his eyes settled into something calmer, he said, "You are afraid of something." She paused with her pen above the record book. "I am afraid of nothing," she said. "You keep checking the staircase," he said. "Your eyes go there every few minutes. You are afraid someone will come down." She put the pen down, said. She looked at him for a moment. This thing she had made, this man-shaped impossible creation, lying on a stone table, who had been awake for less than an hour, and was already noticing things she had not intended him to notice. "You will need to learn how to walk," she said. She did not answer his observation, but she also stopped checking the staircase. The next 3 weeks were the strangest of Evelina's life, and she had spent 8 years conducting forbidden experiments alone in an underground laboratory. Lucien learned. He learned to walk with the focused intensity of someone who found the act genuinely interesting, rather than merely necessary. He learned to sit, to hold objects, to navigate doorways, to manage the specific physics of candlesticks and glassware, and the weight of a coat. He learned to eat slowly, with the careful attention of someone who is cataloguing information rather than satisfying hunger. He learned speech the fastest. By the end of the first week, his voice had settled. By the end of the second, he was constructing sentences that sounded entirely natural. By the end of the third, he had begun asking questions Evelina had not prepared for. "What do people talk about?" he asked one evening. When they want to seem clever without saying anything true. She had been going over accounts at the small desk in his room, the East Wing bedroom she had furnished specifically for him, away from the servants' quarters. "Politics," she said, without looking up, and when they want to hurt someone without being blamed for it. "Rumors, and when they love someone but will not say it." She looked up then. He was sitting very still in the chair by the window, looking out at the dark grounds of the Manor. His profile was sharp in the candlelight. The jaw, the straight line of his nose, the dark hair that had begun to fall slightly out of the perfect stillness it had held when he first woke. He looked, she thought, almost real. "They say nothing," she said, "and they hope the other person notices." He turned from the window. "That seems inefficient. Most human behavior is." He considered this. "Are you human?" She set down her pen. "Of course I am." "Then you are also inefficient sometimes." She picked up her pen again. "We are not discussing this." He turned back to the window. But she noticed for the rest of that evening that the corner of his mouth carried the faint memory of something that was not quite a smile, but was learning how to become one. Evelina chose the Valadorn spring reception as the occasion for Lucien's debut. It was the second largest social event of the noble calendar, attended by every titled family within 3 days' ride of the capital. The Queen Mother would be present. Lord Cedric Valmont would be present. Lady Morwen Blackthorn, the eldest and most observant noblewoman in the kingdom, would be seated in the chair she occupied at every event, the one near the second window, from which she could see everything. Evelina dressed carefully that evening. She wore deep burgundy with black trim along the sleeves, and a high collar of worked silver. Her hair was done simply, the way it always was soft, dark, held back with small silver clips. She did not wear heavy jewelry. She never had. Her grandmother had told her once that a woman who needed jewels to be noticed had already lost. Lucien, she dressed herself. She had ordered his wardrobe in advance. Long black Victorian coats with silver embroidery at the cuffs and collar, fine waistcoats, dark trousers. On him, the clothing did not simply fit. It settled into something that looked like it had been made for no other purpose than to be worn by exactly this person. He stood in the hall of Ashbourne Manor while she adjusted the final button of his coat and reviewed him with the eye of someone checking equipment before a difficult task. "You remember everything we discussed?" she asked. "You prefer that I say little rather than much," he said. "Mystery is more useful than information in a social environment. I should observe before speaking. I should not smile too readily. I should stand close to you when the conversation becomes personal, and farther away when it becomes political." "Good." She stepped back. He looked at her for a moment. "You are nervous." "I am prepared. Those are not the same." She turned toward the door. "The carriage is waiting." He followed. And outside, in the cold spring evening air, with the lanterns along the Ashbourne Drive, casting gold light across the gravel, she heard him say quietly to himself, or possibly to her, "I will not let them hurt you tonight." She did not turn around. but her steps slowed for just one moment before she continued to the carriage. The reception hall of Valadorn's capital Mancy was exactly as Evelina had anticipated, full to the edges with silk and whisper, and barely concealed judgment. She walked in with Lucien at her side, his hand offered at her elbow, and felt the room change before they had taken 5 steps. It began as a pause. A handful of conversations thinned. Eyes moved. Then the pause spread outward, conversation by conversation. Like a stone dropped in still water, until a noticeable portion of the room was watching the doorway. Evelina kept her expression composed. Lucien kept his composure as well, but differently. His stillness was not the practiced calm of a noble woman managing her emotions. It was something else. The stillness of a man completely unintimidated by his surroundings, who finds the room interesting, rather than threatening. It was, she had to admit, very effective. Lady Cressida Morne reached them first. Evelina. The warmth in her voice was precisely as deep as its usefulness. Her eyes went to Lucien immediately. And this must be, I confess. We heard rumors, but I did not quite believe. My husband, Evelina said, clearly, calmly. Lucien Vale, we have been quietly settled for some months now. I apologize for the delay in formal introductions. We are both private people. Lady Cressida's smile performed gymnastics. How wonderful. Where is your family from, Lord Vale? Lucien looked at her, not with hostility or coldness, with a steady, attentive focus that somehow made Lady Cressida feel as though she were the one being evaluated. The Northern Territories, he said. My family kept largely to themselves, a preference I have inherited. Lady Cressida laughed slightly too quickly. Of course. How intriguing. She moved away within minutes. The next 3 conversations followed similar patterns. Nobles approached with barely hidden curiosity, and Lucien answered their questions with a precision that gave them information, while, leaving them oddly certain they had learned nothing. He did not perform charm. He simply existed with a completeness that made people slightly uncertain what to do with themselves. Lord Fenwick, who had stood near the fireplace at the winter ball, and announced that the Ashbourne line died with Evelina, found his path crossing theirs near the center of the hall. He stopped. Lucien looked at him with those silver-grey eyes they read as silver in the chamber, but in ordinary candlelight they shifted toward something between silver and steel, and waited. Lord Fenwick said, with uncomfortable joviality, Lord Vale, word travels fast, but I must say, not fast enough in this case. I had no idea our Duchess had found a husband, Lucien said pleasantly. Lord Fenwick blinked. Yes, exactly. She had one, Lucien said. She simply had not yet decided the rest of you deserved to know about it. Lord Fenwick made a sound like a laugh and moved away quickly. Evelina said nothing for a moment, then quietly, that was unnecessary. You told me to stand close when conversations became personal. I told you not to smile too readily. I did not give you permission to dismantle people. I did not dismantle him. I simply told him the truth. A pause. Should I not have done that? She looked up at him. He was watching Lord Fenwick's retreating back with a calm, observational expression. No, she said quietly. It was fine. From across the room in the chair by the second window, Lady Morwen Blackthorne had not taken her eyes off them since they arrived. She held a glass of wine untouched in her gloved hand, and watched with the stillness of a woman who has seen many things and is trying to decide what category this one belongs in. and in the far corner, near the pillar draped in the Valmont family colours, Lord Cedric Valmont watched Evelina with an expression that was not joy and not grief. It was a calculation. The carriage ride home from the reception was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then Lucien said, "The man by the pillar, the one with the green and silver crest. Who is he?" Evelina looked at the dark countryside, passing outside the window. "Why do you ask?" "Because you avoided him specifically. You moved around the room all evening without avoiding anyone else. But every time he shifted position, you adjusted yours." She was quiet. "He hurt you," Lucien said. "Not as a question. That is not your concern." "You created me to be your husband," he said. "You told me yourself, I am here to protect you from the world that mocked you. How can I do that if I do not understand what it is I am protecting you from?" She turned from the window. He was watching her with that level, attentive focus that she was beginning to suspect had nothing to do with programming or instruction. It felt, frustratingly, like genuine concern. "His name is Cedric Valmont," she said. "We were engaged years ago. He ended it badly. He said certain things to certain people. That is all." Lucien nodded slowly. He turned to look out his own window. After a moment, he said, "He looked at you tonight the way a man looks at something he wishes he had not let go of." "That is not your concern either," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I thought you should know." The carriage moved through the dark, and Evelina, pressed back into her corner of the seat, felt something she had not expected to feel this evening. Triumph, not satisfaction, not the clean relief of a plan proceeding correctly. She felt, for just a moment, less alone. She found that more disturbing than any of the rest of it. Spring became summer in Valadorn, and summer brought longer light and shorter patience among the nobility. The kingdom could not stop talking about Lucien Vale. They tried, with the relentless machinery of aristocratic gossip, to dismantle him. To find the crack in his story, the loose thread in his history, the moment where the mystery resolved into something ordinary and dismissible. They asked around the northern territories and received answers vague enough to be useless. They consulted old registry books and found a family name that existed, but had no extensive record. They watched him at every event and could not agree among themselves what they had seen. Lord Fenwick said he was too quiet to be trusted. Lady Cressida said he was the most compelling man she had encountered in a decade. Lord Cedric Valmont said nothing at all publicly. Privately, he began making inquiries. Back at Ashbourne Manor, in the house that had belonged to generations of Evelina's family, something quieter and stranger was happening. Lucien was learning to feel. It had begun with small things that Evelina attributed, at first, to the natural progression of her binding work taking hold. He laughed once, unexpectedly, at something Miriam the maid said in the kitchen. A real laugh that surprised all three of them into silence. He began making small decisions independently, requesting a particular book from the library, choosing which coat to wear without being told, rearranging the furniture in his room by some internal logic she could not determine. He began to feel cold. That one alarmed her. She had not built that into him. Cold was a sensation rooted in biological response, not construct. She examined him quietly over the course of a week, watching for other signs, and found them. The faint color that rose in his face near heat, the way he stretched his hands in the morning with the automatic stiffness of someone whose joints had been still through the night. His appetite, which had been minimal at first eating, seemed more like an exercise. To him, initially deepened into something that looked genuinely like hunger. She wrote it all down in her record books. She did not examine what it meant. She only recorded it. Meanwhile, they built something between them that had no precise name. In the evenings, when the manor was quiet and the servants had retired, they sat in the main library. She read. He also read, working through her shelves with systematic curiosity, choosing books not by subject, but apparently by thickness, beginning with the thinnest and moving toward the heavier ones, as though building his endurance. He asked her questions about the books, then about the people in them, then about the world outside the books. "In the novel you gave me last week," he said one evening, looking up from a battered copy of something she had read at 17, "the woman spends 200 pages refusing to tell the man she loves him, because she is afraid he will not say it back, and then she spends 50 more pages suffering for it." "Do people actually do that?" "Frequently," she said. "But it seems so easily corrected. She could simply say the words and know." "Knowing is the problem," she said. "It is much easier to live inside the possibility that someone loves you than to find out for certain that they do not." He was quiet, turning this over. Then, "Have you done that?" Lived inside the possibility. She kept her eyes on her own book. "I have been cured of it." "By Lord Valmont?" She turned a page. "We are not discussing this. You say that about everything that matters to you." She looked up. He was watching her with that still, attentive expression. But there was something in it tonight that was different, a quality she did not have precise words for. Warmth, perhaps. Not the warmth of fire or sunlight, the warmth of someone who has decided to stay in a particular place. "Lucien," she said carefully, "you understand what you are." "A man," he said. "A created man. There is a difference." "Is there?" He set the book down. "I feel cold in the winter and warm near fires. I feel interested in some ideas and bored by others. I feel something when you are distressed that is different from what I feel when you are at ease. If those things are different from what a man feels, I cannot identify how." She held herself very still. "That is the work of the binding. It is designed to simulate Evelina." He said her name, just her name without the title, for the first time. Quietly. "I know what you are afraid of." She waited. "You are afraid that if I am real," he said, "then what you have done is something other than clever, something with consequences you did not plan for." She closed her book. She stood up from her chair. She said, with the kind of evenness that takes enormous effort to produce, "Good night, Lucien." She walked to the door. She heard him say, behind her, very quietly, "Good night, Duchess." But the pause before the word Duchess, the half-second where a different word might have lived, stayed with her all the way to her room. 3 weeks later, things began going wrong. A stable boy reported seeing a shadow in the east wing that moved against the direction of the candlelight. A kitchen maid said she found her work basin full of dark water that had not been there an hour before, and that the water had not moved when she touched it. Evelina's personal maid, Miriam, sharp-eyed, loyal, and deeply practical, came to Evelina's study with a composed expression, hiding something that was not entirely composed underneath. "The old painting in the upper corridor," Miriam said. "The one of your grandmother." The eyes moved, my lady. I saw it directly. Evelina put down her pen. Paintings do not move, Miriam. No, Miriam agreed. They do not. She said nothing more and waited. Evelina went to look at the painting herself. Her grandmother looked back at her from the canvas with the same serene, guarded expression the woman had worn in life. Nothing was different. The eyes were where they had always been, but there was something on the floor in front of the painting. A mark, faint as breathing, in the shape of a circle with a line crossing through its center. Evelina recognized it from the old journals. It was a detection symbol, one that activated only when forbidden magic was being sensed from the outside. Someone was looking for them. She went to Lucien that night. He was not in his room. She found him in the garden, standing perfectly still in the dark, face turned upward toward the clouded sky. He was not dressed for outside, no coat, no gloves, and had been standing in the cold long enough that there was dew on his shoulders. Lucien, she pulled her own shawl tighter against the chill. "What are you doing?" He turned. His silver eyes had changed. Not dramatically, but the way some mornings are different from others, in ways you cannot name, until later the light sits differently. The air has a different weight. His eyes held something new. Not confusion or sorrow or the careful attentiveness she had grown used to. Something older, something that sat in his gaze like a stone at the bottom of clear water. "I remember something," he said. "What do you mean?" "Not from here, not from Ashbourne Manor or the chamber or anything you showed me." He paused. "I remember a room with a very high ceiling, blue walls. A specific sound is a bell, but not from outside, from somewhere in the room. And someone saying my name, not Lucien." He paused again. Evelina was very still. "A different name," he said. "I cannot hear it clearly, but it belongs to me. It belonged to me before this." She said nothing for a moment. The night air moved between them. "Come inside," she said finally. "You will catch a cold." "I do not get sick," he said. "You have recently begun to feel cold," she said. "We are not taking chances." She turned back toward the house. After a moment, she heard him follow. And she walked slightly faster than usual, because behind her calmness, behind the measured expression she had worn like armor. For 10 years, something had cracked open that she did not know how to repair. She had not given Lucien any memories. Whatever he was remembering had not come from her. The High Inquisitor Severin Hale arrived in Valadorn on the 5th day of autumn. He came without announcement, or rather, with the specific kind of announcement that is not made publicly, but is understood by everyone who matters. The Inquisitor's carriage was black with no crest. His staff of priests traveled in plain clothes. They moved through the city quietly, staying in modest accommodations, attending only the least prominent functions. And yet within a week, every nobleman in Valadorn knew they were there. The Church of Valadorn had always maintained that certain practices were abominations against the natural order: necromancy, blood rituals, soul binding, the alchemy of flesh. These things were not merely illegal, they were defined in the Church's doctrine as acts that unmade the boundary between life and death and invited destruction into the world. Over the past 3 centuries, the Church's inquisitors had investigated dozens of cases. Most resolved quietly. A few did not. The ones that did not resolve quietly were remembered. Lady Morwen Blackthorne sent Evelina a note. It arrived in a sealed envelope delivered by a very old servant, who waited to confirm it was received directly. The note contained 4 words: written in handwriting as precise and dignified as everything else about Lady Morwen. "They are watching you." Evelina read it twice. Then she burned it in the study fireplace and sat for a very long time looking at the flames. She had always known this was possible. She had planned for it in the theoretical way one plans for extreme weather, acknowledging it might come while not truly believing it will. It had come. She went to the chamber beneath the manor. She examined every element of the binding she had constructed around Lucien, every sequence in the journals, every protective element she had put in place. She strengthened what could be strengthened. She added 2 additional layers of concealment to the chamber itself. She did not tell Lucien. She had decided not to, and she held to that decision for 11 days, during which she watched him move through the manor with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent months becoming more completely himself, and felt something she recognized as guilt without knowing quite what to do with it. Then, on the 12th day, Lucien came to her study and sat down uninvited. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Something has frightened you, not in the quick way of a sudden shock. In the long, sustained way, the kind of fear you carry rather than react to." She set down her pen. "The church is here," she said. She decided in that moment that lying to him was worse than the risk of telling him. He did not move. "They are looking for you, for evidence of what I have done." "Yes." "What happens if they find it?" "Heresy charges. Execution at the extreme end. The loss of my estate and title at the minimum." He was quiet for a moment. "And me? What happened to me?" She met his eyes. "They would destroy what I created. That is the doctrine." He turned to look at the window. Outside, the autumn light was going grey, pulling the color out of the garden in long, slow stages. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I am. Lucien, not the way you mean. Not as a question of your ritual or your binding, as a question of experience." He turned back to her. "I think I am afraid of dying. I do not know if a created person can be afraid in that genuine way, or whether what I experience is some version of the instinct you built into me. But the sensation feels very like what you describe fear to be." She was very still. "That is important," he said carefully. "I think it means I do not want to stop existing. Not because it is against my programming, but because I have become interested in what comes next." She could not speak for a moment. "Evelina." He used her name again easily, with a naturalness that no longer startled her. "I will not let them find what they are looking for. Tell me what I need to do." She took a breath. "We need to appear normal," she said. "More present, more visible. We need the nobility to look at us and see nothing unusual, so the inquisitors find no social support for their investigation." She paused. "It means more events, more performance, more of what we did at the spring reception, but sustained. That is manageable." "It also means," she said quietly, "behaving more convincingly like a married couple. Not in any way you are uncomfortable with, but in the way that people who know each other well behave in public, comfortable, familiar, not performed." He looked at her. "Is that difficult for you?" She picked up her pen. "We will manage it." He stood to leave. At the door he paused. "Evelina, the memories I told you about. The room with the blue walls and the bell." She kept her eyes on the desk. "Yes, there are more of them. They are becoming clearer." She said nothing. "I do not ask you to explain them," he said. "I only wanted you to know." He left. She sat at the desk for a long time after that, not writing anything, just holding the pen and listening to the quiet of the manor around her and the very uncomfortable thought that had begun to take shape in the back of her mind. Something had come with the soul she had called, something that had been waiting longer than she knew. 2 weeks later, at the autumn court gathering, Evelina and Lucien attended together. This time the room did not go quiet when they entered. This time it adjusted the social machinery of the nobility, recalibrating to absorb the new reality of them. Lucien Vale was no longer a scandal or a mystery. He had become, in the way of things in Valadorn, a fact. Lord Cedric Valmont maneuvered to their side within the first hour. He wore his family colours with the deliberateness of someone who wants to remind you of something. He smiled with the ease of a man who has never questioned his right to be in any room he enters. "Duchess," he said. "Vale." A nod so precisely calibrated it could not be called disrespectful, without also being called oversensitive. "You've both been a topic of considerable conversation." "I would imagine so," Evelina said. "There's a great deal of interest in Lord Vale's origins, specifically." His eyes moved to Lucien. "The Northern Territories are a large area. Which family seat specifically?" Lucien looked at him with the calm, steady focus he gave everything. "The Havelock estate, originally, though my branch of the family relocated when I was young. I'm sure you understand how fluid those things can be." Lord Cedric's expression didn't change. "Of course." A pause. "It's interesting. I've made some inquiries through family connections in the north. The name Vale doesn't appear as prominently as one might expect for someone of your standing." "Not all good families are loud ones," Lucien said. "Indeed not." Lord Cedric turned his eyes to Evelina. The calculation in them was precise and long practiced. "I hope we might have a more private conversation soon, Evelina, about old matters." "There are no old matters," she said. "Only present ones." He smiled. He moved away. Lucien said, very quietly, as soon as they were alone, "He is not curious about me. He is trying to find a way to make you afraid." "I know," she said. "What does he want?" She kept her eyes forward, watching the room. "He wants what powerful men always want: more power. He is trying to determine whether I am vulnerable, whether what he believes about me and about you can be used." A pause. "Used how? To take my estate," she said quietly. "If I can be charged with heresy, my title is stripped. My lands pass to the nearest male relative eligible under Valadorn law. Cedric has positioned himself, over years, to be that person's nearest influential ally." She took a slow breath. "He has been planning this longer than I realized." Lucien said nothing for a moment. "Then he will not succeed." It was said with so much quiet certainty that she turned to look at him. His expression was calm, steady. But underneath it, underneath the composed, attentive face she had grown to know across these months, there was something new. Something that looked, she thought, like protectiveness. Not because she had built it into him, because he had grown it himself. "No," she said softly, "he will not." From across the room, in the chair, by the window, Lady Morwen Blackthorne watched them both with eyes that had seen kingdoms rise and fall, and had learned, in the watching, that the most dangerous things are always the ones that start quietly. She took a small sip of her wine, and decided it was time to introduce herself. Lady Morwen Blackthorne's invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, written on paper so fine it felt like held breath in Evelina's hands. She requested the pleasure of Duchess Ashbourne's company for afternoon tea. alone, without Lord Vale. The phrasing was not insulting. It was precise. The difference mattered. Evelina went. Lady Morwen's townhouse in the capital was narrow and 3 stories tall, crammed between 2 broader buildings, as though the city had grown up around it, rather than making room for it. The interior was very dark, very warm, and filled with objects that did not look like decorations. They looked like items with histories, things kept because they had belonged to people who were gone, or because they had witnessed something that could not be witnessed again. Lady Morwen sat in a high-backed chair near a fire too large for the room's size and waited for Evelina to settle across from her before she spoke. She was, as the rumors described, severe in posture, white silver hair styled with unfussy elegance, black gown with pearl detailing, lace gloves, a silver cane, resting against the chair beside her. Her face carried its age with the dignity of something that has earned every year, and her eyes pale, very clear, too attentive to be comfortably moved across Evelina's face, with the systematic thoroughness of someone reading a document. "You are holding up very well," Lady Morwen said, which was not what Evelina had expected her to begin with. "Better than I would have at your age, under this particular pressure." "I appreciate the observation," Evelina said carefully. "It is not an observation. It is a recognition." Lady Morwen poured tea from a pot that had clearly been steeping far longer than necessary. "I know what you have done, Duchess. I know what is living in Ashbourne Manor, and I have not told the Inquisitors. You should be wondering why." Evelina accepted the offered cup. She kept her expression composed. "I assumed you were waiting to see how it was resolved." "Partly." Lady Morwen settled back into her chair with the ease of a woman who has been sitting in difficult conversations for decades, and has learned that comfort is not a weakness. "And partly because I have a personal interest in what you have created, one that predates your particular experiment by about 40 years. Evelina was very still. "Explain." Lady Morwen looked at her over the rim of her cup. "Prince Alaric Vane, 3rd son of the Vane dynasty, erased from the historical record by royal decree in the reign of King Aldous III, 87 years ago. The official reason given was illness. The real reason was that the young prince had discovered something about the Valadorn Church, that the royal family and the church both preferred he had not discovered." "What did he discover?" "That they used the same forbidden magic they condemned," Lady Morwen said simply. "The church's holy bloodline, the line of succession through the High Inquisitors, was established and maintained through soul-binding rituals 3 centuries ago. The prince found the original records. He was 17 years old and, apparently, possessed of extremely poor strategic instincts for a boy surrounded by dangerous people." She paused. "He was killed quietly, removed from the records entirely. His soul, if the old practitioners believed what I believe they believed, should have passed into the waiting, as all souls do." Evelina set down her cup. "It did not," Lady Morwen said. "I have believed for most of my life that Prince Alaric's soul was caught, that something in the manner of his death, or something in what he knew, held him in a state of suspension, and that somewhere in the old alchemical record there was a ritual that might, under the right conditions, provide his soul with a vessel." The silence in the room was very complete. "My ritual," Evelina said. "Your ritual," Lady Morwen confirmed. "I do not think you summoned him deliberately. I think the conditions you created were exactly what his suspended soul had been waiting for. And I think, if you examine what you know of Lord Vale, you will find that the things he remembers, the rooms, the sounds, the name align with what I know of the prince's history. Evelina was silent for a long moment. He is not simply my creation, she said. He has not been simply your creation for some time, I suspect, Lady Morwen said. Not unkindly. You built the vessel, but what fills it now, what has been filling it since the early weeks, learning and growing and becoming, that is Alaric. Changed by your making, shaped by your world, real in a way that has nothing to do with the ritual that began it. And you have known this for how long? I suspected from the first event you attended. The way he moves, the way he looks at certain things. There are paintings of the Vane family from that era in private collections. The resemblance is not accidental. Evelina stood. She needed to stand. She moved to the window and looked out at the narrow street below, at the ordinary movement of the city, while something enormous rearranged itself in her understanding of everything that had happened over the past months. He needs to know, she said. Yes, Lady Morwen agreed. It will change things. It has already changed things. You are simply in the position of deciding whether to lead that change or be caught by it. Evelina was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you helping me?" Lady Morwen was quiet for a long moment. "Because Alaric's death was wrong," she finally said, "and because I am very old, and I have watched this kingdom protect itself by destroying things it should not destroy. I do not intend to watch it happen again." Evelina returned to Ashbourne Manor in the late afternoon. She found Lucien in the library, as he often was in the hours before evening, sitting by the tall window with a book, the low light settling around him in a way she had stopped noticing and started feeling, the way you eventually stop noticing a piece of music and start being affected by it. He looked up when she came in. He knew, immediately, that something had happened. He closed the book. She sat down across from him and told him everything, every word of it. Lady Morwen's history, Prince Alaric, the suspended soul, what the memories meant and where they had come from. She did not soften it or build it carefully. She told him plainly, because he had asked her, from the first weeks, to treat him as someone capable of receiving truth. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was very quiet. He looked out the window for a long time. Then he said, "A murdered prince, yes. Murdered because he knew about the church." A pause. "And I have been walking through a kingdom run by the people who killed me. You were not you then, but I am now." He turned from the window, and his eyes, those silver eyes that had opened in the underground chamber months ago, with confusion and sorrow, held something that was not sorrow anymore. Something older and more complex. The gaze of someone who has suddenly understood the full dimensions of the room they have been standing in. "Evelina, what the church knows about forbidden magic. They use it themselves," she said. Lady Morwen confirmed it. He was quiet for a moment that stretched and stretched. "What do we do?" he asked. She looked at him across the space between their chairs. This man she had made, this soul she had accidentally caught, this person who had spent months becoming real in ways she had not planned, and could not fully explain, and felt, with a clarity she had been avoiding for weeks, that she was not willing to sacrifice him to anyone's doctrine. Not the church's, not the kingdom's, not her own careful planning, "We'll finish this," she said, "on our terms." He held her gaze. Then he said very quietly, "Together?" She held his gaze back. "Together," she said. The Kingdom Ascension banquet was held in the Grand Cathedral of Valadorn, a building so old its stone had turned the color of winter water. Its high windows, lit by 200 hanging lanterns that made the interior feel like being inside a kept secret. The entire nobility of the kingdom attended. The Queen Mother sat in the ceremonial chair at the head of the nave, elevated slightly above everyone else, as she always was. The High Inquisitor Severin Hale stood at the far end of the hall, near the altar, in full ecclesiastical regalia, and surveyed the room with the patient focus of a man who has been moving toward this particular moment for a long time. Evelina and Lucien arrived together. She was in deep black with silver at the collar and sleeves, not mourning colors, or not only mourning colors. It was deliberate, precise, the color of someone who has stopped apologizing for what they are. Lucien wore the dark coat with silver embroidery he had worn to the first event, which she had come to think of as his armor, and he stood at her side with the absolute stillness of someone who has decided exactly what they are going to do. They had planned for this, or as much as anything could be planned, when half the variables were in the hands of a church and a kingdom, and a man who had spent 3 years moving his pieces into place. What they had not planned for was how fast it happened. Lord Cedric Valmont did not wait for the formal proceedings. He stepped forward within the first 20 minutes. Before conversation had fully settled, before the social warmth of the gathering had reached the temperature where people stopped paying close attention, he stepped forward and he spoke loudly enough to be heard by the entire hall. "I would like to bring something to the attention of the assembly," he said, "and I apologize for the directness. But I believe the evidence I have gathered demands it rather than a quiet chamber process." The room stilled. "Lord Vale," he said, turning to face Lucien directly, "is not who he claims to be. He has no verifiable family history, no documentation of birth, no social record of any kind prior to his appearance at Duchess Ashbourne's side this year." He reached into his coat and produced a sheaf of documents. "I have engaged investigators across the Northern Territories. There is no Havelock estate bearing the Vale name. There are no family records, no church entries, no financial transactions. He did not exist prior to the moment Evelina Ashbourne introduced him to this kingdom." The silence was a living thing. "Furthermore, Lord," Cedric said, his voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who has rehearsed this many times, "I have in my possession records from a former Ashbourne Manor servant, dismissed 8 months ago, who attests to strange events in the east wing of the manor, unusual materials brought in under privacy, and sounds from beneath the property that she describes as, and I quote, directly sounds that had no natural explanation." He looked at the High Inquisitor. "I believe the Church may wish to speak." Inquisitor Hale moved forward. He was a tall man, grey-haired, with the particular air of someone who has exercised authority for so long it has become indistinguishable from his personality. He looked at Lucien with the focused, professional interest of someone examining a problem. "Lord Vale," he said, "or whatever the correct address is, I would ask you directly, are you a natural man?" The hall waited. Lucien stood very still for one moment. Then he turned his head and looked at Evelina. She gave him a small nod. He turned back to the Inquisitor. "No," he said clearly, so the entire room heard it. I am not. The sound that went through the hall was extraordinary. Hundreds of people reacting simultaneously in the specific Valedorn aristocratic way, which meant a rising murmur controlled just short of actual shouting. I was made, Lucien said, by Duchess Ashbourne. Through means that your doctrine classifies as forbidden. I have been present in this kingdom for 8 months. I have attended your social events. I have spoken with most of you directly. He paused. And I have found in that time that the distinction between what I am and what you are is considerably narrower than your doctrine would prefer. Inquisitor Hale raised his hand. Around the edges of the hall, where Evelina now noticed, there were far more priests present than the event would normally require. Figures in plain clothes straightened. Duchess Evelina Ashbourne, Hale said, by the authority of the Valedorn Church, and by agreement with the Crown, I charge you with heresy, the practice of forbidden alchemy, and the creation of an abomination. You are remanded to church custody pending judgment. Evelina looked at him calmly. I have an alternative proposal, she said. This is not a negotiation. You use the same magic you condemn, she said, loudly, clearly, to the entire hall. The church's holy bloodline was established through soul-binding rituals identical in method to what I practiced. I have documentation. She reached inside her gown and produced the copies she and Lady Morwen had prepared together meticulously, sourced and referenced. 3 centuries of records, acquired from private collections by a peer of the realm, who has also been keeping this information for the right moment. From the second row of attendees, Lady Morwen Blackthorne stood up. She was perfectly composed, her silver cane in hand, her pale eyes on the Inquisitor. Good evening, Severin, she said. She had known him for 30 years, by the tone of it. I believe this assembly deserves a complete picture of what we are discussing. The chaos that followed was not the elegant, murmured version of aristocratic disagreement. It was something rawer voices rising, people standing, the Queen Mother's face moving through several expressions, quickly. The priests around the edges of the hall, stepping forward in response to some signal Evelina could not see. The Inquisitor, his expression stripped of its professional composure, for the first time raised both hands. He spoke a word that was not a normal word. It came from his hands in a wave of heat and white light, directed at Lucien. Sacred fire, the doctrine called it. The purifying element. The mechanism by which abominations were unmade. Evelina moved, but Lucien was faster. He stepped directly into the fire's path, placing himself in front of Evelina with such complete decisiveness that there was no gap between the thought and the action. The fire struck him across his arm and shoulder. The sound it made was wrong, not the sound of burning, but of something deeper. Something that shook the air in the hall the way a struck bell shakes. He did not fall. He stood. His coat was burned along the shoulder. The skin beneath it, Evelina could see from behind him, was red and damaged in the way of something genuine rather than constructed. He breathed through it, slowly, steadily, the way someone breathes through real pain. And then he said to the Inquisitor, in a voice that was absolutely controlled, "Try that again, and I will remind you of what you are fighting." Something happened beneath their feet. It was not visible at first. It felt a vibration that moved through the cathedral floor, in long, sustained pulses, like the heartbeat of something sleeping at enormous depth. The lanterns swayed, the high windows rattled in their frames. Then, the floor at the altar end of the cathedral split open. Not catastrophically, a single deliberate crack that ran from the base of the altar to the center of the nave, and from which rose a sound like the deep places of the earth were exhaling for the first time in a very long time. From the crack, the darkness moved. Not evil, exactly. Not the theatrical darkness of the Inquisitor's doctrine. Old dark, the kind that had been compressed and held for decades by the weight of what the Church had buried above its secrets, rituals, the erased record of a murdered boy prince, and the forbidden methods that had established an entire religious institution. Released now, rising through the crack with the patience of something that has been waiting for exactly this. The hall descended into genuine fear. People ran. Not all of them, the bravest or most stubborn, stayed near the walls. The priests converged on the crack, attempting containment. The Inquisitor turned from Evelina to the larger problem, with the expressions of a man whose controlled situation has exceeded his ability to control. Lucien turned to Evelina. His shoulder was burned. His eyes were absolutely clear. "The ritual," he said. "Not here, Evelina." He reached out and took her hands. He was warm, genuinely, completely warm. "This darkness I can feel. I recognize it. I think it has been following me since before I woke in your chamber." He looked at the crack in the floor, and in his expression there was something she recognized as memory. The deeper memory, Alaric's memory, the murdered prince who had known too much and paid for it. "I think I know how to stop it. If you go into that, it will not destroy me," he said. "I do not think it can. I think it is mine." A pause. "But I need to do it alone, and it may take some time." She looked at him. She looked at the burned shoulder. The real pain he was carrying without showing it. The silver eyes that had opened in her basement chamber with confusion and had spent 8 months becoming something so far beyond confusion that she did not have adequate words for what they held now. She said, "If you go in there and you do not come back, I will." "You will be fine," he said. "You are the most capable person I have encountered in either of my lives. And you have Lady Morwen, who is worth an army." A pause. I will come back." "Lucien," he let go of her hands. He walked toward the crack. She stood there, in the middle of the grand cathedral of Valadorn, surrounded by chaos and fear and breaking doctrine, and watched him step forward into the rising dark. He did not look back, but just before the darkness folded around him, she saw his hand open and close at his side, the motion she had come to understand in the months of knowing him as the gesture he made when he was grounding himself in something real. He was grounding himself in her. She pressed her own hand to the place where he had held it, and she began to run the calculation of what she was willing to risk and what the final forbidden ritual required, and whether she was, in fact, the most capable person in either of his lives. She decided she probably was. She pulled out the small notebook she carried inside her gown. She began to work. The darkness inside the crack lasted 43 minutes. Evelina knew because she counted. She stood at the edge of the break in the cathedral floor, notebook open, the final forbidden ritual laid out in her handwriting, every element checked and rechecked, while around her the cathedral erupted and contained, and erupted again. The priests managed partial containment of the shadow, enough to stop it spreading, not enough to stop it from existing. Lady Morwen positioned herself near the Queen Mother and began a conversation that, by its body language alone, was clearly the kind that would not end quickly or pleasantly for the Crown. Lord Cedric Valmont, who had begun the evening's disaster with such precise confidence, stood near the outer wall of the cathedral and did not move. His documents were still in his hand. The audience he had planned his performance for had comprehensively abandoned the performance for something larger. He had the expression of a man who has started an avalanche and discovered it has a direction of its own. Inquisitor Hale attempted 3 times to approach Evelina. The first time, she said, "Touch me and the notebook goes into the crack." He stopped. The second time he said, "Duchess, you do not understand what you are dealing with." "I built what is down there," she said, without looking up from her work. "Do not explain it to me." The third time, he stood beside her and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "If he comes back damaged, he will not. You cannot know that." "I know that better than you know anything you have built your entire career upon," she said, and the steadiness of her voice in that moment was the bravest thing she had ever done. "Stand back, Inquisitor!" He stood back. At 43 minutes, the darkness in the crack began to pull inward rather than pushing out. The sound changed, that long exhalation, becoming something more like a settling, the specific quiet of something that has been agitated for a very long time and has finally come to rest. Then Lucien stepped out of it. He was not unmarked. The burn on his shoulder was worse, or looked worse in the cathedral light. There was exhaustion in him that was not manufactured, the genuine weight of sustained effort, of someone who has done something very difficult and is currently paying the honest cost of it. His coat was damaged beyond the shoulder now, and his hair had lost whatever order it had held, and he was, in all visible ways, a man who had been through something real. He looked at Evelina first. She crossed the distance between them. She did not think about the cathedral full of people, or the Inquisitor watching, or the Queen Mother, or Lord Cedric Valmont, or any of the elaborate, life-altering political chess game that was still actively being played all around them. She covered the ground between the crack's edge and where he stood, and she reached up and put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him directly. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, tired, real. The darkness is settled. What it was, what had accumulated in the foundations here, the buried things, the hidden rituals, it has been released. Properly. It will not come back the way it was. "Are you?" "I am intact," he said. He brought his hands up and covered hers where they rested against his face. "Evelina, I remembered everything. All of it, Alaric. I remember all of it now." He paused. "It does not change who I am." She looked at him. "He was frightened," Lucien said softly. "The boy prince at the end. He was 17, and he knew too much, and he was very frightened." His silver eyes were steady, carrying the memory without being flattened by it. "I want you to know that I wanted things. Before it ended, small things, time, knowledge, someone who would have seen him fully." A pause. He wanted what I found. She realized in that moment that her eyes were not entirely dry. She removed her hands from his face and turned them over, and looked at her palms and breathed once, very deliberately, like someone recalibrating. "There is still the matter of the church," she said. "Yes." and the ritual I have prepared, which I have not yet decided whether to use." He looked down at the notebook in her hand. "What does it do?" "It binds my life to yours permanently. Not as creator and created that binding has been dissolving for months. As you became more completely yourself. This is different. This is equal, a shared anchor. It means that neither of us can be destroyed without the other being at risk." She paused. "It also means that whatever you are, whatever Alaric is, whatever this impossible combination of created body and ancient soul is, it becomes fully legitimate in the old alchemical sense, not an abomination, a being. With rights the Church's own original doctrine was forced to acknowledge before it revised itself." He was quiet for a moment. "It changes your life," he said. "It already has," she said. "Months ago." "I just was not ready to say so." He looked at her with those silver eyes that had spent 8 months learning everything human. And behind them, behind Lucien's careful, attentive intelligence, she could see the echo of the frightened 17-year-old prince who had wanted small things and been denied them, who had been denied time and knowledge and someone who would see him fully. "Evelina," he said, "I think I love you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I think I have loved you for longer than I have been willing to admit, which has been extremely inconvenient." The corner of his mouth moved that nearly smile she had first noticed in the early weeks, which had grown, over months, into something real and warm and specifically his. "Then use the ritual," he said. She opened the notebook. She worked quickly and precisely, as she always worked. The words of binding the old language, the one her ancestors had passed down in sealed journals, came from her steadily, each one placed with intention. She used her own blood, the small silver blade she kept in her coat pocket, a circle drawn on the cathedral floor that would have alarmed anyone watching who knew what it was. Lady Morwen watched from the distance with an expression that held, beneath its regal composure, something that looked very much like relief. The Inquisitor watched and did not speak. The light changed when the binding took place, not dramatically, not with the theatrical display of bad fiction, but in the specific way the light in a room shifts when a window is opened that has been closed for a long time. Something moved through the cathedral air. Something settled. Lucien breathed in, breathed out. He looked at his hands. He looked at Evelina. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. The aftermath was long and messy in the way that real things always are. The documents Lady Morwen produced were real. The Church's council spent 3 weeks in increasingly panicked deliberation about their implications. The Queen Mother presented with evidence that the institution she had spent her reign backing had been built on the same forbidden foundations. It, condemned, chose the politically survivable option and announced an independent ecclesiastical review. Inquisitor, Hale was quietly reassigned to a position that was prestigious in title and entirely without power. Lord Cedric Valmont's bid for influence over Ashbourne Manor failed with the completeness of something built on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. He left the capital within a month and did not return prominently to social life for a very long time. The charges against Evelina were not formally dropped. The legal process was more complicated than that and took longer. But they were suspended, and in the specific way of Valadorn politics, suspended meant finished. The kingdom did not transform overnight. It did not suddenly become the kind of place where forbidden knowledge was celebrated or ancient injustices were corrected without friction. Those things do not happen overnight or in a single cathedral confrontation, no matter how dramatic. But things shifted. The way things shift when enough truth comes out at once, that the old shape of the lie can no longer hold, not all at once, but in pieces, and each piece makes the next one easier. Lady Morwen, who had been quietly collecting her evidence for 40 years, and had been patient enough to wait for exactly this moment, sat in her narrow townhouse with a glass of wine and felt something she recognized, after some thought, as satisfaction. Evelina and Lucien returned to Ashbourne Manor in late autumn. They did not disappear entirely from public life. That would have been strategically foolish, and Evelina was never strategically foolish. They appeared where they needed to appear. They attended what needed to be attended. They contributed, in ways that were quiet and deliberate and real, to the ongoing process of a kingdom reconsidering itself. But they came home to the manor, to the library in the evenings, where they had always been at their most completely themselves, to the books and the questions and the particular quality of the quiet that had accumulated between them over months of genuine knowing. On a cold evening in early winter, Evelina sat at the desk she had used since childhood and watched Lucien across the room, where he stood at the tall shelf with the heavy books, working his way through the thickest ones now, his dark head bent at the familiar angle of concentrated interest. She thought about what she had been 2 years ago, a woman who had sealed herself inside her bitterness and her knowledge and her very justifiable anger, and had decided that if the world would not give her love freely, she would manufacture it on her own terms. She had been wrong about what that would produce. She had been wrong in the most instructive possible way. What she had produced in her underground chamber with her ancient journals, and her precise hands, and her careful, furious grief, was not a weapon or a performance or a corrective to her humiliation. She had produced the conditions for something to find its way to her, and it had. Something extraordinary and impossible and inconveniently real, in the form of a man with silver eyes, who asked too many questions, and noticed things she did not intend him to notice, and had spent 8 months growing a soul while she was busy trying to decide if that was her problem or not. It was her everything. She had not planned it. Plans were overrated. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Across the room, without looking up from his book, Lucien said, "You are thinking something significant." "I am always thinking of something significant. This is different." Your pen stopped moving. She smiled. It was real and unguarded in a way that her smiles had very rarely been before all of this began. "I was thinking," she said, "that I was entirely wrong about how this would go." "In what way?" "I thought I would create something I could control. That would make the world stop hurting me." She paused. "Instead, I created a situation I had no control over whatsoever, and the world still hurt me on the way through. And it was the best thing I have ever done." He looked up from the book. His silver eyes crossed the library and found hers, and in them, in the depth of what had accumulated there over these impossible months, was everything she had thought she was building toward when she was 22 and had not found, and had given up expecting, and had somehow, through the most improbable path imaginable, arrived at anyway. "Good," he said. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. Years later, the villagers who lived closest to Ashbourne Manor would tell visitors a story. That on winter nights, especially during storms, you could see a light in the windows of the old manor, warm and steady, not the blue-cold flicker of ghost light that the superstitious might expect, but the ordinary amber glow of candlelight. The kind of light that meant someone was home. Sometimes, they said, if you stood on the road that passed the east gate and looked carefully at the upper library window, you could see two figures, one seated, bent over some work, and one standing at the bookshelf, and they moved the way people move who have been in the same space long enough that they have stopped performing comfort and simply have it. Some visitors asked if the Duchess still lived there. The villagers always said yes. Some visitors asked about the tall man with the silver eyes, who was sometimes seen walking the grounds in the early morning. The villagers always said, "That is her husband. Just her husband." As though it were the simplest, most unremarkable thing in the world, as though there was nothing strange about it at all. And on those winter nights, inside the manor, in the library, with its tall shelves and its history, and its two people growing old inside a love that had come from grief and anger, and the stubborn refusal to accept that the world's limitations were final. The candles burned, and Evelina wrote, and Lucien read, and the kingdom outside continued to become, slowly and imperfectly, something better than it had been. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.